All right, near as I can tell, we are live. I'm not 100% certain because, I don't have my normal setup here.
Yeah.
We're on the road. I'm coming to you live from an undisclosed location somewhere in Western Europe. I don't know how precise I need to be. I think anybody knows where I am at this point. I'm hanging out in London, and we figured why not try a remote between chair and keyboard. Raju, you're good enough to be my guinea pig on this first go round here of what is it like to try to do this job remotely. So good morning, right? It took me a second. I had to do the math in my head real quickly,
Yeah.
but good morning, Raju. It's good to have you back on the show, my friend.
Thank you for having me. And it's what your BST, right? So you're 6 hours ahead of me, I think. So good afternoon to
Oh,
you
five
and
five hours ahead of you. So it
5 hours
is
ahead of me.
a little after 2 or 1400 here in the wonderful British Isles. And the weather's actually been relatively cooperative. I would say relatively. Saturday was gorgeous. I got to go
Mm.
visit Bletchley Park. That was a lot of fun. And it was just about the most perfect weather you could possibly have while hanging out in a place that is near and dear to the heart of anybody who's in our line of work, at least. But yeah, it's nice to be on the road. I think mostly.
Yeah.
So I know
I,
you've been having some travel fun too, although not internationally at least.
Nothing international, but you're right. It is so much nicer to be in front of people and talking.
Uh-oh. Let's see. I just lost my audio from Raju. Raju's muted. Raju's unmuted, maybe. Oh, your mic's not connected, Raju. What did you do, Raju? I can't unmute Raju. There we go. Now can.
Sorry about that.
There
Uh,
we go. Okay, you're back.
my,
We're back.
my Bluetooth connection disconnected for some reason.
Because of
Um,
technology, my friend. I have the same issue. I mean, I'm just hoping that everything works the way it's supposed to. Supposedly this
yeah.
cable-free world is our future, but I'm not feeling it yet.
Yeah, I'm not sold on it. Yeah. Anyway, I just closing the last thought. I swear those Zoom avatars are like imprinted behind my like eyes. Like when I close my
Right.
eyes at night, I see that window of faceless. Yeah,
Checks
it
out.
is.
Checks
I'm
out.
glad to be back on the road.
It's strange, right? Because we spent a lot of time on the road, and then it just stopped, and then we were
Yeah.
home for 2+ years, and now it's like we went from 0 to 60 again.
Yeah.
There wasn't even like a warm-up period of let's kind of
Mhm.
get the legs loose, let's stretch. I was telling somebody this the other day, but before Dev Nexus, I actually had to like go through my backpack and throw out all of the things that had expired, because you have all that stuff in there that you need when you're on the road. You got your Advil and whatnot, and you're like, yeah, I probably need to refresh basically everything that's in my bag. And I realized actually in my travel kit, my toiletries kit, I have some stuff in there that clearly needs to get turned out that I forgot about on this last trip. But what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do?
Yeah, and it's always actually the first trip that I made this year, and I know you are aware, so if anyone's watching, they probably don't know, but I travel with a little folding stand-up desk.
Yep.
Um, and the first trip I made, I got in the uh, I oh, Michelle was dropping me off, so my wife was dropping me off to the airport. I got in the car with her. I go through my checklist on my phone, and the fourth item is
Yep.
stand-up desk, and I'm like,
Yeah.
"Whoa, hold up, I gotta
Oh,
go."
wait.
Yes, completely slip. It's so hard to fall out of practice. So the things you do
Oh, I
so
know.
regularly, right? It is amazing.
Well, you forget how to pack, you forget what to bring, you forget what you can live without. And I've now this is my second international trip, and the biggest challenge is you have to take a COVID test to get back into the US. So you've got this added sort of anxiety around finding a test, getting it to happen the day before you fly, and then preparing, having enough stuff with you in case, oh yeah, I might actually have to be here another 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, who knows. And yeah, so that adds just one more layer of joy to the whole process when you realize there's additional moving parts. But what are you going to do?
Yeah, that's the reason why I'm not going international yet. I get stuck in a foreign country and ugh.
Yeah, I suspect that the restriction is going to end soon. Although Neil Ford and I did a food tour in Shoreditch yesterday, and there were a bunch of couples, not surprisingly, on this tour. And as we were at kind of the last stop, I was helping this person who also happened to be from Georgia, and I was helping her like, hey, here's a couple of the sites that I was recommended for tests because she was flying out in a couple days. And so one of the couples that was at the table was like, wait, test? What do you mean test? And we're like, oh, well, you do know you need a negative COVID test to get back into the United States. And we're like, what? We had no idea. And I thought, yeah, you're going to need to find a testing
Oh
location.
no. Oh
So they
no.
were unaware of that requirement, and they were very happy to be made aware, I guess, of that requirement. So I
Oh
guess I did my good
wow.
deed, yeah, for the
Yeah,
day.
but and I think that's the biggest struggle, that because I don't know, the trip I would make if I was going international back to India to visit family, because I haven't seen them since 2018 actually.
Right.
2019 my parents came up here. So yeah,
It's a
2018,
long time, man.
and I just don't know what is the protocols for
Right.
entering India, what are the protocols for
Right.
leaving India, entering the US, and it's just too much anxiety attached to it. And traveling is hard enough, especially.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and they're the rules are changing on a really regular basis too, which makes it
Right.
even more challenging. And I suspect that requirement is going to end for some value soon. I think a lot of us thought actually beginning of May was when they're going to drop that, since most of Europe dropped their requirements in April, but we still cling to it for reasons that are obscure to me. Since
Yeah.
the great irony is you could fly into Canada where you don't need a test, and then you could drive into the country which does not require a test. So if you cross a
Oh,
land border, no test is required. If you land at a port, you don't need a test. So I guess you could land somewhere and then take a boat into the United States and then fly home, and then it would be okay, or rent a car and drive south and then it would be okay. That's the part I just find mind-boggling. And your flight crew is also exempt from the testing requirements. So apparently there's no chance the flight crew can be bringing COVID back with them. So
oh, interesting. Yeah, I've come to the conclusion that the day bureaucracies become more efficient, entire swaths of industries will get wiped out.
yeah. Yeah, that's possible. That is
Yeah,
possible. So yeah,
yeah.
I'm gonna try to use the same testing procedure that my buddy Mark used last week. So I've requested a test be sent here to my hotel, which should be here tomorrow, sometime on Friday. I just need to take the test, send them my information, and that should be that. So, fingers crossed I get to come home on Saturday.
Yeah, fingers crossed, brother. Oh boy.
So how's everything else going? What's new and exciting in the world of Raju? And we absolutely will get to that wonderful portrait that's hanging over your, I want to say, right shoulder.
Not much. Like I said, I'm back on the road, which is always exciting.
Yep.
Um, just embarked on a new project with Neil Ford and Mark Richards.
Oh, fantastic.
So yeah, that's um, I'm not entirely sure how much of the details I can give away right now,
Okay.
but it
Fair
is
point.
we've met a couple of times to discuss details and ideas. It
Okay.
is a book, so I can't say that. But we'll see what happens over there. I literally signed on to that book 3 days after Headfirst Git was officially in production. So the time gap between books for me went from
It's getting shorter.
is getting shorter, I think. I think it's hard. I think if anything were to happen, then if I sign up for a next book, it'll most likely happen when I'm writing this one.
There you
So
go.
yeah, I don't know if that's a good trend. I'm not convinced it's a good trend, but we'll find out.
We'll find out. We'll find out. Yeah. Well, I guess if you get to the point where you're pulling a Venkat and you're cranking out a book a year, but you're writing the book in about 4 weeks, then we know you've got a problem, and we'll stage an intervention on your behalf.
Yeah.
But
Thank you.
I think I might know a thing or two about that book. I may or may not have had dinner with Neil once or twice in the last few days. So, and I may or may not have more dinners planned with Neil later this week.
Yeah, and if something comes up, and if you get a chance and he signs off, then feel free to let the world know. I need to talk to them and see where they stand.
Probably
I
a good
don't think
idea.
I don't think we have anything that officially prevents us from disclosing anything, but I just want to make sure I'm not jumping the gun without them knowing. Yeah.
Smart. Well, let's talk about Headfirst Git, since that's hiding over your shoulder, and I do definitely think that that's one of the coolest aspects of writing for O'Reilly. You get that wonderful cover. Oh, look at that. See, now normally if I was in my wonderful home studio, there would be a copy of your book right about here, I think, over my shoulder. I didn't think to bring it on the road. I do apologize for that. But so how was the process of writing a Headfirst book? I mean, I remember when Kathy first kind of went down this path, I thought they were brilliant. I just loved her approach. They were so mind friendly, I guess, learner friendly, and I just really liked how she attacked this space. And it was really interesting to see that book series grow beyond its initial kind of things, and then now to have a friend who was in that authorship is, to me, a pretty cool thing. So tell me what that process was like. What did you think of it? Things of that nature.
It was, I will say, so since this is my second book, the first one being a more traditional tech book, it was. So let me take a step back and say, before I started writing the book, I already knew everything that was going to go in the book. So thankfully, I wasn't doing any research while writing the book, because writing a Headfirst book is so much different than writing a regular tech book. I think I was talking to someone the other day, and they asked me about Headfirst, and I said the only other kind of series that comes even remotely close to what Headfirst does is the grokking series from Manning. This, grokking simplicity, grokking machine learning, or whatever. There's a new. They're getting into the same space, or trying to get in the same space as Headfirst.
Sure.
But Headfirst, the thing is that every page is different. So you can't use traditional publishing tools to work on the book. You can't use Markdown or AsciiDoc or ASCII Doctor, which is, Dan Allen, good friend of ours, manages that project. All of that goes out the window. What you're using is Adobe InDesign to lay out every page, which makes the writing process and the collaboration process extremely hard. Because your editor may or may not be conversant with InDesign. There's all these things about how images are linked in the document, how fonts are loaded. It almost always happens that the first few times you try and collaborate over an InDesign document, things just fall apart.
Sure.
So the learning curve there for me was not just InDesign, which I had never used. I don't know how many developers would have ever touched InDesign in their life before. But it was also
few,
learning.
I would expect.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other part was learning how to write a Headfirst book, because you've read the book, you reviewed it, so thank you for doing that.
Of course.
But it's
a very specific voice.
Very specific voice, exactly. It's very conversational, but also the narratives that we had to come up with. We had Sangeeta working on the hot dog app or the dog dating app. We had the chef working on, or not the chef, but the sous chef working on multiple menus for the fall menu and the Thursday menu for the 80s diner. We have Trinity, who's the wedding planner or the party planner. I mean, it's just, you have to come up with all these things and get creative. And again, it's because you don't have the tools that we are usually familiar with, which is plain text
Right.
and everything that builds on top of plain text, right? Git itself, version controlled, uh, and you can script your way through stuff. When I did my first book, there were so many scripts I had written around ASCII Doctor to make changes easy. All of
Sure.
that goes out the window. So one
Right.
thing about Git is every time you commit, you get a new commit ID. And
Hmm.
the part that I struggled with was you start writing a chapter, you take these screenshots, well, not screenshots, but sort of screenshots of the terminal, which show, oh, I made this commit, and that commit has an ID. Well,
Hmm.
let's say your editor says, well, oh no, let's change this little bit. Well, if you change the document, then for my examples, all the commit IDs would change. Then you have to go through the whole chapter, tracing every place where you have that
Oh
commit ID and
no.
change those commit IDs. So
Wow.
the one thing I learned after my second chapter with Headfirst is it's very hard to get the tone right. And
Sure.
if you don't nail the narrative before writing the first word of that chapter, just stop writing because you
Sure.
absolutely need to think of every edge case. Otherwise, you're going to be reading every word and saying, "Oh well, that commit ID needs to change or this file name needs to
Right.
change," because none of that's applicable anymore.
Sure.
But all that to say, um, it was fun. We had so many brainstorming sessions. I know I've reached out to you when I was writing the book.
Hmm.
I reached out to Venkat. I reached out to my editor, Sarah Gray from O'Reilly, and it was nonstop, just analogies, metaphors, examples.
Yeah.
What can we do to make this fun? So yeah, I think the reason I signed on it was because I know there's a very select group of people who have written a Headfirst book, and I'm like, why not? It sounds like a pretty exclusive club. That was my
That's as
entire
good a reason as
motivation.
any.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to write a Git book for a long
Right.
time.
Right.
This is not the book I would have written because in a traditional
Interesting.
text, I could have covered a lot more of what I wanted to
Sure.
cover.
Sure.
So I had to pull back on how much material I could have covered. But I still think that, uh, I, like you and many people who are listening to us, we are never satisfied with what we do,
No.
right? There's always
No.
that. But I am very happy with this result. This is one of those
You should be.
places in my, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. So all in all, some rough edges around the process, but once you get done with it, it's a pretty good feeling. And
Yeah.
and I will admit, I was pretty happy on January 13th when I said it's gone, it's finished.
It's
It's
shipped, baby. It's shipped.
it, right. Um,
Well,
the
I,
one
I
one
think
thing
that
I will
to
say,
oh, go ahead, Raju.
real quickly, I just want to say one thing that O'Reilly, because they do print on demand, the nice thing is if we do catch an error, we can actually fix it, and anyone who
Sure.
buys the copy after that will have the fix because we're not
Oh, that's
printing
awesome.
en masse. So, and you just
Right.
want to
Right.
mention that. Sorry, go on. What were you
No,
saying?
well, I think to your point that the depth maybe wasn't as far as you could or would have gone. I think that the voice, the style, that head first kind of approach really helps cement some of the common misunderstandings of Git. I think especially around, well, what is this ID thing, and what is that pointing to, and what is head, and what does it mean when I, move where head is, and just all those different kind of weird things that Git does that when you first encounter, you're like, I don't understand what's going on. I don't know. Raju said to type in this command, so I did, and something happened, and so I think that frankly, Git lends itself very well to a head first undertaking, frankly.
Yes, and that's the part we struggled with initially because they've had Headfirst Agile written and they
Hmm.
wrote a book, Headfirst Scrum, I think. But
Okay.
if I recall correctly, they've never written a Headfirst book on a tool before,
Oh, sure.
right? So they have programming languages are typically what Headfirst has been targeting: JavaScript,
Right.
Python, Java, Swift, Go, Ruby, but never a tool. And so
Sure.
as we were starting to think about how to lay this thing out, one of the initial parts of it were, well, there are some elements. And when I say elements, if you've never read a Git book before, an element is a thing that repeats itself in the book. We have exercises of certain kinds, we have characters that show up at certain kinds.
Hmm.
Um, all of those were designed for programming languages.
Right.
But so there were some elements that we just threw out the window from the catalog of Headfirst elements and said can't use them because they are designed
Sure.
for programming languages as opposed to a tool.
Right.
So even O'Reilly, thankfully, was patient enough to say, okay, let's try and see how we can work this out. The
Yeah.
other thing one thing that I think this is the second book, maybe, or maybe it's the first, that has the new look and feel of Headfirst, which is
Okay.
no stock photos, but only illustrations. And my push towards Headfirst was I wanted a diverse character set. So we
Hmm.
have Sangeeta, who's Indian, we have Trinity, who's African American, all those characters. So we actually had to have the illustrator, like, say, go and make all these illustrations for us that never
Sure.
existed for the book. Um, so again, two big kind of obstacles when it came to Git. But you're right. The more I wrote the book, Headfirst is the ideal way to describe Git because almost every
Right.
tutorial you see of Git is all pictures, right? When you add
Right.
something to the index, what happens? When you go to the commit, what happens? And Headfirst is the perfect way to lay it out.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. 100%. Did you? How hard was it to sort of come up with the storylines and the characters? I mean, what was that process like? Because I don't even know where I begin to try to think up that part of it. It's one thing to know these are the technical topics I want to cover and this is kind of the rough order they should be covered in, but then to weave that into the narrative arc of these recurring characters and these recurring storylines, what was that process like?
Certainly not my strength, which is, for us developers, the creative side of it's almost like writing a comic, right? We don't do
Sure.
that. We're not
Right.
in the creative side of things, or at least that kind of artistic creativity, right?
Right. Coding
It
is
was
creative. Don't let anybody tell you coding's not a creative process.
uh, it was hard. I have pulled in, like I said, I called you up, called Venkat up. I had a list of scenarios that might work. Everything from a car mechanic shop, sorry, not car mechanic shop, car assembly line, sort of to
Sure.
discuss branching.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
uh, um, I had one on there was a doctor involved somewhere. I think it was a doctor's clinic or office to discuss something. Um, I had a whole, I think, 15 different ideas and Michelle came up with a few. So my wife, Michelle, she's actually the one who came up with the recipe one, the one we
Oh,
used to
sure.
describe branching. She came up with the recipe and we molded it into just menus as opposed to recipes of food.
Yeah.
My editor, Sarah Gray, we threw out some ideas around like poetry, because then again, you have
Oh,
divergence in various versions.
right.
But it was hard. It took us the longest time in well, not the longest, but the initial upfront 1 to 2 weeks of starting the next chapter was just sort of iterating over what's just the best idea that fits this particular topic.
Sure.
And so once we got the hot dog, the dating app dogs, inspired by our two furry friends, and we got the menu one. The one that I really struggled with was the wedding planner because
Mm,
for that chapter I couldn't find a good way to talk about things because
okay.
it was the undo chapter, which was,
Okay.
you make a mistake in Git, how do you undo it? And then there was, oh, I'm sorry, not the undo chapter. Forgive me. searching chapter. So how do you search
Hmm.
commits, diffs, patches, log? And we had to come up with enough creativity around it to have not just lots of commits, but lots of diversions, but
Right.
also needed a reason to undo something, right? Like you need a story around that.
Right.
Um,
Right. It's that narrative arc piece.
Correct. So, we would do silly things like, oh my God, we got the date of the engagement party wrong, and how do we fix it?
Sure.
And I've already added it to the index, and how do we revert that? And it was just that was one of the hardest ones we came up with. But yeah, to
Sure.
your point, not our strength.
No.
Thankfully, you, Venkat, Daniel Hinonosa,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would just call him up randomly on a walk and say, "What do you think about this?" And he would try and fold it and mold it. And Dano's got that sense of humor, right? He can just make anything
Right.
funny,
Right.
uh, which we had to be careful about because the first thing they told me about Headfirst was it has to be fun but not funny. And so again, a
Interesting.
very thin line on where you're
Huh.
trying just enough to be clever without, again, big struggle. But
Right.
so yeah, to answer
Fun
your question,
without being funny.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Huh.
And as you write the book, you start to realize initially, uh, Eric Freeman and Beth Robson, who wrote the design patterns, Headfirst design
Hmm.
patterns, they managed the series now ever since Kathy Sierra sort of stepped away from the role of leading Headfirst at O'Reilly. And initially they talk to you and they say all these things, right? Well, you're allowed to be fun, but not funny. And I'm like,
Sure.
okay. And usually you just gloss over that, like, I'll
Right.
figure it out. Or they'll tell you, well, this particular element is only used for this kind of a setting. You're like, whatever. But as you write the book, you start to understand how well thought out everything in Headfirst is. Nothing is
Right.
arbitrary. Um, and my Michelle's uncle Gary works sort of in the education material space. So they work for
Hmm.
companies that work with schools for selling textbooks or something like that. And he
Sure.
saw it and he said, this is the perfect textbook because you have
Sure.
prose, you have exercises, quizzes, we have the no dumb questions segue, which is a way to reinforce and catch caveats. And so he looked at it and he said, what happens if the student has questions that are not in the main prose? I'm like, hey, we have no dumb questions. He's like, huh.
Hmm.
He's like, how do you close off every chapter? I'm like, we have a bullet points or summary.
Yep.
And so he's
Yep.
like, this is a textbook. This is essentially a
Right.
textbook in a very different format.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I'm hoping, and maybe this might be visual thinking on my part, but I think Git is becoming so pervasive and ubiquitous that it's something that students should learn in undergrad
Yeah.
before coming into the industry. And I'm
Right.
hoping that some university somewhere picks up, not for any other reason than I think that Headfirst Git is a great way. Any of the Headfirst books, like if you're teaching them
Right.
Python, it is a textbook
Right.
in a fun way as opposed to many other books. But long story short, yeah, it was harder.
Well,
Lots of long nights.
oh yeah, well, and to your point, I think one of the things I've always appreciated about the head first style is that it engages different learning modalities, and you've got different ways of reinforcing the material, and I think it's incredibly applicable to a wide range of audiences, and
Hmm.
that's not easy to do, and so I think that's part of the challenge in how you lay it out, and because it's so highly visual as well. For me, I'm more of a visual learner. And so that really has resonated with me since the first time Kathy laid that approach out. And, just it demands a lot more of the author than here, let me just bang out some stuff in a text editor and then commit it and away we go. And, so kudos to you for taking the time to do it.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to put this in the book, and then I thought it might be a little passive aggressive, but this book, um, My first book, I actually, committed everything in Git, and I had
Yep.
branches if I was writing a different approach to a chapter.
Sure.
Ironically, this book, despite being written for Git, wasn't managed using Git.
Yes.
just,
Yes.
just
That's so
because,
funny to me because yeah, because that's such a natural thing. I mean, I think of the last 3 books that I've written, they were all managed in Git, and that was such a huge
yeah,
improvement over wait, rename the file, and wait, am I working on the right version of the file? And wait, did you put your initials in there, or do I put my initials in there? And did you put the date? Or it's such a huge improvement to just be able to do a commit and say, yeah, it's in there, go ahead and pull it, and it's so much easier. So it is ironic that you wrote an entire book about Git without using Git.
yeah. Well, yeah, and because we tried, but the Adobe InDesign format is a proprietary, which it has to be
Right.
because it's kind of like OneNote, right, by Microsoft. It's such a unique thing that's hard
Yes.
to plain text your
Yes.
way into it. Um, and while it was in Git, I would commit and push and commit and push. We weren't using any of Git's facilities. We couldn't diff, we couldn't
Right.
patch, we couldn't compare, we
Right.
couldn't branch. Because even if you branched, what would you do then? You can't merge.
Right.
It's a
Right.
proprietary tool.
Yep.
So I wanted to put that in the book. It's but I thought best to leave it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Well, I was thinking about this earlier because I mean, I've been using Git for a long time, and I was amazed at the things I picked up reading your book. And I was just kind of curious if you had, now having gone through this process, having taught a lot of people Git, do you think there's a particular aspect of Git that is misunderstood more frequently than others, or anything about Git that people have a harder time kind of getting their head around maybe than other concepts?
Um, I think that probably the most well, before I answer what's the most misunderstood part of Git, let me mention what is the most overlooked part of Git, which is the fact that under the hood, it's essentially a directed acyclic graph of commits, right? So
Yep.
it's basically a graph database if you think about it, but you only have acyclic connections, so you can never have a recursive back and forth. And once you figure out how that graph grows, or let me rephrase that, how Git manipulates that data structure when you're working with Git, can frame everything in Git, right? So when you make a branch, a lot of people visualize the sort of subversion way of working, which is duplicating
Right.
the tree structure, which is not true in Git. It's simply a post-it
Hmm.
note that gets attached to one of those nodes in your commit graph.
Yep.
And I think that is probably the most overlooked part, because if anyone spent just a little bit of time saying, okay, when I make a commit, there's an arrow from here to here, when I make another commit, and then how does a branch affect that? You are well on your way to understanding how Git
Right.
works. In terms of misunderstanding, I've been, sort of I teach Git on the road, you know that, and I've been trying to break up my session. It's a 3-hour session on sort of Git internals. And I have a couple of myths that I've been highlighting. So one myth is Git stores your files, because people have this impression, right? When you add a file name and Git's adding that file. It's not. It's actually tracking the contents of the files, not the files themselves. So that's the first one, but that's not the more important one. I think the more important one, and one of the most misunderstood parts of Git, is that when you take a file and you add it to Git, so you put it in the index, and then when you commit it, a lot of people have this impression that Git empties out the index,
Hmm.
right? Which is not true. Actually, at any point in time, if you have a file that you've added and committed, you can sort of think of it as 3 versions of the file. There is one in your working directory, one in your index, and one in your object graph. And Git diff compares the index and the working directory. Sorry, the working directory and the index. So anytime you see file modified, what it's telling you is the last time you added this file to the index and what I'm seeing in your working directory right now are different.
Mm-hmm.
So your file is modified. When you take that modified file and you add it to the index, now your working directory and the index look the same. So Git says, okay, whatever you have in your working directory is in the index, but it compares the index with the commit graph, the last commit, and says, well, the index looks different than the last commit on this branch. And that difference is what you are seeing as things staged but not
Mm-hmm.
committed. The reason why this is important to understand that your index is actually growing over time. It has every file you've ever added to Git. And in fact, when you switch branches, Git actually takes whatever was last committed and plays it back on the index, and then takes that index and plays it back on the working directory. So it sort of synchronizes all three working areas. It's important to understand this because when we work, we go from working directory to index, index to commit graph. So
Mm-hmm.
if your working directory is clean, all three areas look the same, right? What Once you understand this, then reset starts to make more sense because reset is not going left to right, working directory index to commit area. It's going commit area, index, working directory. And that symmetry is what will make things like anytime you've tried to switch branches and Git tells you, no, you can't switch branches. I see modified stuff in your current branch and you're going to overwrite it with your other one. All of that falls into play. All you need to understand is three working areas and actually Git's, depending on what files you're adding and committing, those files aren't going anywhere from the index. The index doesn't get flushed out, you know. I think that's the big one for me because it's a, people do reset a lot, right? It's just you make a
Mm.
mistake, you reset, you make a mistake, you reset. And the typical approach is git reset hyphen hyphen hard head or whatever. No one knows what it actually does. Uh, but it turns
Ain't
out
that the
that
truth?
actually that's the worst option of the resets. There
Sure.
is a git reset soft, there is a git reset mixed, there is a git reset merge, there is a git reset keep, and they all have different behaviors. But when you
Right.
read the documentation, none of it makes sense because
Right.
if your understanding of Git is I add stuff to the index and when I commit, the index gets emptied out, none of it makes sense. The
Right.
documentation just doesn't feel like what? So it moves it back to the index. Why would I have stuff in the index? Well, that's because there's always stuff in the index. You just don't
Mm-hmm.
know it. I would say that would be the one I've been struggling with a lot when I've been teaching Git because whenever I demo reset, I always use git reset head. And people always
Okay.
ask me, don't you use the hard flag? And I'm like, oh, here we go. So they have to spend 20 minutes explaining what I just explained to
Right.
you,
Right.
then explain to them what the difference between hard, mixed, and soft
Yep.
is. And so
Yep.
I'm beginning to think, I think I just need a new subsection of slides to just quickly go
Yeah.
through this because everyone just
Well,
hits the same point.
I mean, for what it's worth, Raju, I think many of us with Git, you you learn an approach, and usually it's because somebody on your team does it this way, or the person you're pairing with did it this way, and so you just do it, and you're not really sure why. But you're just like, oh,
Right.
I always do it that way, and you're like, but why? I don't know, because Raju told me to, and there's because I've run into those kinds of issues where okay, I'm not entirely sure if this is the right way to do it, but it works or it seems to work. And then you
Mhm.
just, that's how we've always done it, kind of crops into the equation. And I guess that other way of phrasing that is a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yes. And I think that in this case, it's particularly much more because there are no safety nets. Programming languages get cruft over time, but you see paradigm shift. I think
Sure.
with Git, I always have this conversation with folks. Oh, we just, we have all these branches and we cherry pick commits across. And the problem with cherry picking is it's a tool, it's there, but
Right.
90% of the times it's abused more than it is used.
Sure.
Um, and so there's no safety net to tell you, don't do this. There's no compiler
Right.
warning that says this is
Right. This is
deprecated
a
or
bad idea.
whatever.
Yeah.
Correct. And so that's to your point, we've always done it this way, you know. Oh, hey,
Well, the
Dan's
real Dan
online.
Vega. Yeah. So you guys are neighbors. You know that, right? I
Yep.
can say OH.
Ayo.
There we go. So Dan says it's really hard to lose your work, and there's some truth to that, and I do think that's also one of the things I appreciate about Git, and it also allows you to basically chop your foot off and then make your foot reappear if you know the magic incantation, or if you know who to
Mhm.
talk to get the magic incantation.
Right. And yeah, Dan, thanks for bringing that up. Actually, a great point, which is also the reason why I tell people that when you do a reset hard, that's a destructive change,
Hmm.
where you can lose work, especially if you have work in your index or your working directory that you would like to keep after the reset. That's one scenario. The other scenario that you can lose work, which is now explicit in Git, is the new command git restore, which helps you. We used to previously do a git checkout file, and that would get you back to the place where you wanted to go to. We now have a restore command, which is explicitly destructive. In other words, you type the words git restore, and you're signing the dotted line that says, "I
Right.
will not sue
Blow this away.
for." Yep, yep.
Yeah.
But thanks for bringing that up, Dan. Yeah, absolutely. Really hard to lose your work. Yeah, it's fantastic. I love the fact that Git always has a safety net. Somewhere
Yeah.
there's a safety
Yeah.
net to catch you. Yeah.
Well, and I think for me, when I first was introduced to Git, it took me a while to kind of get my head wrapped around why I would want to use Git instead of Subversion. And,
Mhm.
I think that that's true for a lot of us. We get to that point where like, but I'm pretty productive in this tool. And especially when it's such a different way of solving the problem. I mean, what's wrong with checking out a file? I mean, except for when the guy goes on vacation or leaves for the weekend and I need to get the file, but they've already left for the weekend and now I can't get, I got to break their lock and except for all those problems that we had with Subversion, but I really liked Subversion. So, it took me a little while to kind of get my head wrapped around because it was such a paradigm shift from the way we had done it before. And then you have to sort of remap or relearn some of those concepts, some of those approaches, and then use the tool the way it is optimized to be used, as opposed to trying to use it as if it were Subversion or a similar type tool.
Yeah. Absolutely. The when you have a paradigm shift like that, mapping old concepts into this one don't work. It's almost always well, not almost always, but very often an anti-pattern. Um, and it's funny because again, we're talking about Linus Torvalds here, not a man who minces his words.
No,
No, he, if anyone has a chance, he gave. Google used to have these tech talks on their
no. Yep.
campus years
I
ago,
watched it.
and
Hmm.
yeah, Linus was on it. And
Hmm.
Linus's, take on it was someone asked him, what was your design principles behind Git? And he mentioned a few things that they had hit with Perforce when they were trying to manage Linux development. But then he said, and again, not a man who minces his words, he said, anytime I got stuck at a design decision point and I didn't know what to do, I looked at CVS and said, what does CVS do? And did the exact opposite.
Uh-huh.
Um, which, to your point, leads to, if you're doing something in CVS or Subversion, which are
Right.
similar ideologies, moving them to Git is almost going against the grain because the design
Right.
principles in Git are the exact orthogonal opposite to what CVS did. Um, and I think that argument about, well, I already know X, why would I need to learn, or why do I need to use Y?
Yeah.
Um, when we started writing the book, that was one thing that Eric Freeman and Beth Robson brought up to me, and I told them explicitly up front, my audience, the people I'm targeting, are people who want to learn Git, as opposed to people who have never used version control before, which is could be if you are very junior, if you just came out of college, you
Right.
may have never used version
Right.
control, or people who are trying to figure out why Git is better than X, right?
Sure.
Because I'm not in the business of trying to convince people why a tool is better than another tool, for two reasons.
Right.
One, I don't like to bash tools. Every tool had
No.
its time, has its place,
Yep.
and
100%.
and the second reason is I've had these conversations, you've had these conversations at clients and customers. You tell them, well, maybe we should approach this problem using a different runtime, like Go, or maybe we should think about using containers as a deployment target. And the first question is, well, we use jar files and they work just fine.
Right.
Why would I move? And you can try and convince them of the pros and cons and what the value proposition here is. But if, the question is, well, Java has for loops and while loops and classes. Go has, whatever, for loops and they don't have while loops, but whatever. I don't see any difference. Well, then it's hard to convince someone because at a certain level, every tool is the same as everything else.
Right. Right.
It's just, it's a very hard argument to make. If I still remember I was giving this session on Ansible, which is a configuration management tool, and I had a person in the audience who said, we don't patch our servers, we patch them every 6 to 8 months. This seems like a lot of work to do something I do every 6 to 8 months.
Sure.
And so my argument was, well, for one, if you're doing it every 6 to 8 months, do you remember what you did 6 to 8 months ago? Number one.
Right.
And number two, there's a high likelihood that you're doing it every 6 to 8 months because it's hard to do, right?
Right.
So those are my two
Right.
arguments. And if you are mired in this thought, we don't need to do it other than every 8 months, I can't make an argument that convinces you otherwise, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to your point, part of the challenge there is it's easy to say it's all zeros and ones because, of course, all these things boil down to zeros and ones. And then because they borrow concepts from one another, but often use them in different ways, that can actually exacerbate the problem because you're mapping your previous understanding of that concept to this new and very different, in some cases, understanding that concept. And that's where, again, having that past experience is almost a detriment to learning some tools because you keep trying to map it to the way we used to do it or the way it works in this other tool, as opposed to, well, I don't have any of that baggage, so I'm starting out with fresh eyes.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that a lot of software development happens by virtue of idealism, which is, well, Google does that, so we should do it. They don't need a convincing argument to tell them to use something. And again, that makes sense. There's a reason why Google's using it because it does work. The question you have to always ask yourself is, does it work for me? Right.
Right.
But a lot of people don't ask that question. Microservices is another trend. Well, Netflix does microservices. Yeah,
Netflix is successful. Ergo, yeah.
Yeah. So the idealism piece is what usually sort of frustrates me a little bit because, like I said, I was talking to Venkat a long time ago, and I said, well, I don't like to talk about this because maybe I'm not convinced it's the best solution to every problem or many problems. It may be a good solution for some problems. When I speak about it, I'm sort of putting my name against it, right?
Sure.
And Venkat said, no. He said, Venkat said, if I find something interesting, I'm going to learn it. I'm going to speak about it. I might even write about it. Whether you adopt it or not shouldn't be because I adopted it, right? So he's sort of fighting that idealism model. Do your own research, assess the tool, technique, paradigm shift, whatever it is, against your requirements and see if they fit.
Right.
He's like, the day someone starts using a tool because I spoke about it, or I wrote about it, or you spoke about it, or you know about it, is when we went wrong. And that's
Right.
what
Right.
a large portion of the industry does, is,
Yeah.
XYZ does this, so we should. Well,
Yeah.
not really.
No, that's one of my soapboxes. You need to be ruthlessly pragmatic in this industry. And, anytime you're looking at, well, company X does this, cool. Do you have the same constraints? Do you have the same forces applied to you? We're not all a social media company. We're not all a massive online retailer. I mean, there's different
Mhm.
pressures applied when you are at a financial services company, and we have mid-year renewals and end-year renewals and tax season, and that's the time of year where we get crushed. Well, if you're at a retailer that makes most of their money on the holiday spending period, that's a very different set of constraints than many other industries. And so you have to look at the constraints applied to you and then ask,
Mhm.
does this technology, language, technique, whatever, actually help us or not? And yeah, I guess I brought my soapbox with me all the way over to London. Who knew?
Don't lose that soapbox. It's always a good thing to have handy,
No, it's
just in
hard to get
case you
that
need to
thing
reach
through
for it.
customs. I'll tell you that much. They get picky. Like, what are you bringing a shoebox in for? Couldn't you just use a British shoebox? Yeah, I probably could. Or
Yeah,
soapbox.
well, might be a tad small.
That's true. That's true. Well, I've always wondered. There's like Speaker's Corner, I think it is, and I'm blanking on which park. I know it's over by Marble Arch somewhere, but I always think about that would be a cool spot to hang out as a speaker once, and just what is that like to try to do a talk kind of a thing there. And I don't know what that would mean for us, but I know it's somewhat infamous here in town. But
Interesting.
uh-huh. So now that we are sort of gradually getting back on the road, like how does it feel? I mean, it's been 2+ years, and now we're back in front of real humans again. I gotta say, I missed it. But
Mhm.
what's your reaction been? How's it felt? Things of that nature.
What? So you've done on the No Fluff Just Stuff Symposium tour, at least, I do other conferences, but that's sort of my big circuit that I follow. And we've had uh, various kinds of audiences, right? Some audiences are super engaged, they're
Right,
talkative. You can never finish your slide deck because they have so many questions
right,
flying at you,
right. Those are the
as
best.
opposed to, yeah, those are the best, as opposed to others where you usually run out of slides before your slot's over.
Yeah.
What I've noticed, at least this year, is that of all I think we've done 6 shows or 7 shows, I've not come across an audience where I didn't have a high level of interaction. And
That's
I think
awesome.
everyone coming out of that, we've been sitting at home on Zoom
Yeah.
day in and day out, suddenly are like, well, we have real people to talk to. And so we want to
Right.
talk. And
Right.
it's been very refreshing. And I hope it stays that
That's
way. And
awesome.
I know people sort of fall back on the way or their usual demeanor. But the
Right.
first two, well, let's see, this is May, right? So this is my third
Yep.
month of sort of getting on the road now.
Yep.
Um, it's been awesome. Everything
That's
from
great.
the No Fluff to Dev Nexus to the other conference I did, everyone is like chatty, 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 chatty.
Yeah.
They'll catch you after the session is over. Yeah, it feels good, and I
Yeah.
hope it stays that way. Now, I do admit that leaving sort of the conference part aside, um, I can see a high level of anxiety in traveling. To your point, if you're
Mm,
traveling international, I haven't stepped out of the country, despite now having an American passport. Yay! Because I'm paranoid. Like, especially the kind of work I do, which is mostly consulting. If I leave, go to England, and then get stuck, I don't get paid if I don't show up to work, which is a
right.
big thing for me. There's a good chance that I may have to cover my own expenses because I usually go
Right.
by myself, speaking or whatever. So there's that level of anxiety. I also know, while there's some debate on whether masks are useful or not useful given the variants we have seen, I know when I get on a plane and there's a family across from me with little kids, I usually still put my mask on. because
Sure.
whether we argue the science or not, it makes them feel better that
Right.
people around them are trying to protect their kids. But I can't
Right.
imagine the anxiety you might have as a parent that suddenly the world just unmasked itself and you still have lots of people, especially the little ones, who don't
Right.
have the
Can't be
same
vaccinated
protections
yet.
that we do.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's both good and bad to some extent.
Sure.
Um,
Sure. No, I think to your point, a lot of folks really missed that interaction, and it's been very refreshing to be in front of a live studio audience as opposed to just staring at a screen. And I think people have missed that. And so I have this pocket theory that some companies are going to use in-person events as impromptu team offsites, and that may become more formalized over the course of the next 6 to 18 months, perhaps, as companies really embrace the work from home or work from home majority of the time. And so it becomes very easy to say, all right, well, let's send 8 or 10 people to this event, and then we're going to tack on an extra day or two and do some team exercises, get some team meetings together, go out to dinner, and it makes it a much easier kind of combo platter of things as opposed to trying to do 2 separate encounters. And I do think there's a real need for that. I mean, it has really been good to eat dinner with people that I used to see all the time, and then basically went 2 years without seeing them on anything other than a screen. That matters. That does have an impact. And so I suspect we're going to see some amount of that over the next 6 to 18 months, but that's just my pocket theory, and I guess we'll find out.
That's a great idea, though. I mean, you're already, sort of shipping a bunch of people to a
Right.
different, most likely a different city
Right.
for attending a conference, and tack on to that saying, all right, we're going to, do that little trust exercise where you fall back the
Sure.
next day.
Sure.
And yeah, that's actually a brilliant idea. I wonder if more companies should latch on to that, because it
It's
does make sense.
pretty
You might as well get
easy
people
to
out.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to tack on a day or two. You've already got
Hmm.
them flown in. What's another night or two a hotel, a couple more meals? It's certainly something that we're exploring. Can you have sort of a offsite in a box kind of a product that you could even offer to people? We are just starting to unveil our in-person events. We were in Chicago last month. We'll be in Toronto in June. Looking forward to that. June's a much nicer time to be in Toronto than when I'm normally there in December. I don't know why Adib always brings me up to Toronto in December. It's like, dude, I live in Minnesota. I already get enough of that in December. So, if you're looking forward to seeing us in person, we will be out there as well. So it is nice, honestly, to be back. It is weird to be on the road. I'm not going to lie. And, I forgot just how much goes into getting from point A to point B, and how much time and whatnot is involved in all of that. You forget that flying 5,000 miles takes, 7, 8, 9 hours. There's just no getting around it. Like that block of time is gone, and that's time you can't spend riding your bike or playing golf or other things. So I've been missing that, right? But it has been very, I guess, refreshing, reinvigorating to be able to do some of the things that you can only do when you're on the road.
Yeah, and I think that uh, it's important. Like, when we met up in DevNexus in Atlanta in the middle of April, I met your colleague Whitney, and I met
Mhm.
folks, the DevRel team out of Oracle. And
Yeah.
I can get on an online conference and maybe see you and Whitney and Sharath and all those folks, but that sort of impromptu, which is you go past a booth or you attend a session, you
Right.
walk up to the speaker and have a conversation. That doesn't happen online. Like, I've attended online,
No.
they have these breakout rooms or they have sort of the virtual corridors. People stick to their comfort zones, and I
Oh,
know I do a
100%.
lot of, right? And I do a lot of public speaking, but I'm also extremely introverted. So I'm not the
Yeah.
person who's going to walk up to someone and say, "Hey," unless someone like you drags me over here and says, "Hey, come
Right.
meet with
Right.
me,"
I miss this.
and I'm,
Meet this
oh,
person.
right. So I'm not going to do that online for sure.
Right.
And I think that there's a value proposition that comes out of that, which is,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm glad. Ooh, Jennifer is from Neo4j. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, she'll be on the show
Very
next
nice.
week, and at least if everything goes according to plan, I'll be back in my normal haunt back home. I guess in theory, fingers crossed, right? I guess we'll see if the COVID gods allow me to return home or not.
Yeah. So I do want
I
to
just try
mention
not to
before
think
we
about Friday.
yeah, I do want to mention for anyone who's listening, if they want a free read of the 10-day free read of the book, um, I know I sent you that image. I don't know if I can. How do I show that
Oh,
image on? Let's
I
see.
don't know. That's a
Hold
good
on.
question. Oh,
I
he's thinking
had
now.
it. But if it helps, I'll put up a barcode on the screen.
Uh-oh.
There
Barcodes.
you go.
Get a
Oh,
load of this. Oh, look at that. It's got the sunglasses and everything. Oh, yeah. Too
that's
cool for
right.
school. Get a load of this guy.
So if anyone scans that barcode, you get a 10-day trial on O'Reilly. And even if you're
Nice.
well versed in Git, I do recommend reading the last chapter, which is
Oh,
my take
Raju,
on.
I feel like I know my way around Git. I mean, I'm not an expert. I'd be the first to say that. I think I am productive in Git, competent with Git. I easily learned a half a dozen things that I didn't know were there, or I misunderstood, or I think it's while I think it's fantastic for someone who has never seen Git or even source code control before, I think even grizzled veterans are going to find something in there. They're like, huh, I guess I was wrong about that. So, I think that's part of what I love about your book is it does cover a wide audience, my opinion. So I may
Appreciate
be
that. Thank
biased.
you. But your photo's there on the reviewers list, so.
Oh God. I'm sorry I had to include that.
Good
Well,
times,
well,
good
my
times.
friend, I should let you get back to your day, and I do thank you for hanging out with me and being my guinea pig on my first remote attempt at doing this. I think, fingers crossed, this looks like it went okay. Anytime you're on hotel Wi-Fi, it's always it could get sketchy,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
so far so good. So I do appreciate that, and I know our paths will cross soon. So you take care of yourself, travel safe, and we will see you soon somewhere in the wild.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and to everyone who's listening, thanks for joining. And I hope that this was somewhat entertaining and useful. Thanks for coming in.
Cheers, buddy.